Hello guys. Today's movie is awesome. And based on a true story. It's about how it ends up, a big mob boss. And the world's richest man, Pablo Escobar, was finally caught. Once his weakness is revealed. This is all in the light of Pablo's ex-mistress. A journalist, named Virginia Vallejo. He was the one who became a sax, and pointed out Pablo's weakness. Eventually, Pablo was arrested. Anyway, this story is hilarious, you guys. You'll know what it's like to be a Pablo. In the running of his business. Even to the point of declaring war on the government. Let's get down to business. The film opened in 1993. Where a Colombian female journalist named Virginia just arrived in America with heavy security, drug trafficking. The DIA was brought into an anonymous hotel. This is one of Pablo's closest men. In the next few days will expose his testimony to the American government. How did Virginia get to America? And how important was it that he, until his safety, was heavily guarded by the DIA officers? The story begins in 1981, in Colombia. That afternoon, I saw Pablo and his men, on their motorcycles on Pablo's farm. Accidentally, one of his men ran into a horse that suddenly passed out of the grass. Seeing that the horse was useless, Pablo finally ordered his men to shoot it down. At his house, he spoke to his wife regarding the plans for the guest list, which he will later invite. He will have an inauguration party, attended by artists, as well as other well-known characters. But before the party, Pablo had his men bring his contacts in court, get a record of his past, about the murder of 2 police officers. Pablo here also asserted that the records should be lost, even if they cost a lot, or had to burn down the courthouse. A few days later, a party was arranged. It was a glorious evening, attended by distinguished people, including a popular newscast, named Virginia, who came with a friend. He himself was still unfamiliar, being at parties heavily guarded by armed men. It raised questions for him, as to who Pablo Escobar is. Since he knew only his name, he didn't know what business he was in until he could finally make it, as rich as he is now. It turned out that Pablo had been watching Virginia all along, during his TV program. During that meeting they talked a lot. Including this party that was held, which it turned out to be in order. Inauguration, the building of 2,000 houses, for the poor. Virginia then asked him where the construction money was coming from, but Pablo didn't answer. He just said, "It's better, then Virginia will see the construction in progress." The next day, Virginia, with her TV crew, to the village of Moravia Modeling. An area, on the outskirts, a junkyard there. Pablo was welcomed by the people, even in a poor society, many of their children, named Pablo too. It was during this interview that Pablo said, how much he cares about the poor in the area. That astonished Virginia, and he ended up losing sight of how Pablo had got his money. They grow closer every day. Even Virginia was invited to a secret party on one occasion, where all of them are going to be meeting about transporting drugs onto American soil. At the party, Pablo proudly introduced Virginia to all his cartel friends. She already knows that her current environment, along with the great Colombia mafia. Yet the strange thing is, he felt no fear, quite the opposite. He felt safe in the neighborhood with him. Virginia was further fascinated when she saw Pablo giving direction to her friends. At the meeting, Pablo was dividing the trading grounds. He decided to his friends that his Medellin cartel would take Florida, while the cartel of Cali gets New York State. After the borough split, one day, in Florida, all of a sudden, a big truck, blocking the freeway, and create a long traffic jam, which, of course, upsets people. But they couldn't do anything about it, because the truck driver pointed a gun at them. And as it turned out, shortly thereafter, the plane landed. Pablo's thugs, they just ran right through the damn things. To be transported to safety. The plane itself, abandoned. Come to think of it, it might cost a lot if an expensive plane was left behind, but it didn't. Because that one airplane full of drugs has a big payoff. In just 1 year, the trade from Colombia to America, belonging to Escobar, has gone up rapidly. Even reports say 80% of the drug in America comes from Colombia. The President of the United States, too, intervened, to bring his people together. To get away from that shit. To resolve the issue, the President also made direct reference to a DIA agent named Separate. there's also a representative from Colombia. However, he revealed that he could not afford to take immediate action in his country, given the number of judges and officers who had been bribed. As a solution, they planned to relive the extradition treaty, which is arrests of criminals, so it can be processed in the United States. The plan had also been heard by Escobar's group, and for the solution, Pablo had to enter the political world, so that his hopes, once he had a position later, would be that an agreement could be attempted to be terminated. The plan began, giving campaign funds to the candidates of the People's Representative Council, and with the condition that they also include Pablo, a member of the Senate, and a large bailout of the way. Of course they agreed, and everything was easy. Until they were chosen, and Pablo was about to take one of the seats in the political world, representing his medal. And in the end, on July 20th, 82, Pablo first entered the office of the People's Representatives in the capital. One day, Virginia would attend a TV show held in America. Because he loved her so much, Pablo at the time gave a stack of money as a lunch money. Even Pablo gave me a pretty necklace that didn't come cheap. It was here in America that Virginia was visited by part agency. That came right up to me about his connection to Escobar, who said that he was studying drugs, a lot of which came from Colombia. But boldly, Virginia said, when it was better, the spark came directly to the CIA agent. He also asserted that Pablo was the chosen representative of the people. Meanwhile, at the same time, there's a special meeting. A minister of justice, requesting that Pablo's appointment be suspended. Because he didn't think Pablo deserved to be in the senator's seat with his money in the drug business. Whereas this minister of justice was the one who had been paying for the campaign. Pablo was then completely humiliated, and many people laughed at him. But he went to the defense, challenging the justice minister to provide evidence on his charges. From the very beginning, Victoria forbade Pablo to enter politics, for fear that his job as a drug dealer was exposed. But Pablo remained adamant, and assumed that those in the government would have something to hide. At that moment, more bad news came. His men called and reported that one of the newspapers, who had supported the Minister of Justice, and that Pablo, who had committed the murder of 2 police officers, had been Pablo's then overpaid errand man, had neglected to do his job, and had been left to spend his money on it, and were celebrating. And now, because he was tortured, and he died in a violent manner. In retaliation for being shamed, and also before the minister gets proof, Pablo, along with his cartel friends, came up with a plan to kill both the minister and the news writer. Actually, one of Cali's cartel guys suggested that Pablo change his mind. Because if the minister is killed, then the situation will become more complicated. But Pablo stood by his decision. Eventually, it will have to be at war with the government. The next day, Pablo came to the seedy countryside, where Sicario was. This Sicario is, as they call contract killers who are trained, and financed by drug mobsters. The young boys over there are ready to die for $20,000 cash. And still on the same day, the murder was committed on a busy street. Starts with, killing the Minister of Justice, and the news writer. The images of the murder were broadcast live from Virginia, who happened to be carrying the news. Not only that, he also reported that news of the president coming back, activating the extradition treaty, and putting a full fight against Escobar's drug ring. At night, Pablo went to Virginia, and explained the conditions that are currently taking place. He said whoever stood in front of him would still try to cancel the extradition agreement. Of course Virginia was surprised. And no doubt because it's the government he's fighting. He suggested that it be better, and Pablo looked the other way. Yet again Pablo refused to listen to his proposition. On May 29, 1984, Pablo and his cartel friends negotiated with the government. He proposed that it would help the country pay its debts abroad. However, of course, on condition. He asked for amnesty, for previous crimes, and another, he wanted the extradition treaty annulled. Representatives of the government at the time unfortunately refused. Until then, Pablo had declared war on the government. After the rejection, Pablo made threats and terror to anyone who dared to defy him. Like to a judge, who was sent to die of a heart attack in a coffin. When I heard the crate was delivered by Pablo Escobar. So much terror and terror. The government issued a circular, and anyone who could capture Pablo would be rewarded by 1 billion pesos. At the sight of it, Pablo did not stand by, he had the support from the ground, then ordered his men to arm them. Even here Pablo would be richly rewarded. The one in between is $20,000 for a cop's life, $30,000 for a sergeant, and also a major for $50,000. They're armed boys starting their hunt. There's shooting everywhere, whether it's the cops or the cops doing the search. Everything was stripped down to nothing. The government stayed silent, they ordered more intel, to kill any young people suspected of being Sicario. On top of that, one cop had to be replaced with 10 lives of young men suspected of assault. Wars that get more and more intense got the government to form a special D unit.
IA also teamed up the tracking, tapped into all the phones in Colombia.
Meanwhile, on the other side, Virginia called Pablo and expressed his emotions because it turned out she had been fired from her job just because she had a relationship with a Pablo Escobar. She felt that Pablo had made a career out of him and had pushed many away. Pablo, who was in the jungle, tried to make peace that everything would be all right. But the long-lost Virginia finally broke off all contact with Pablo, and no longer wanted to be involved in anything that had to do with him. Because of the phone conversation, the DIA finally found Pablo's position and immediately deployed special ops to bust him. It turned out that Pablo's team was ready for the surprise attack as well. Their opening pigeons that ended up destroying one of the helicopters. At the same time, Pablo's right hand holding the Cali cartel was also picked up and shot to death on the spot. The rest of the men who were with Pablo in the jungle were all shot up. For his own part, Pablo escaped and survived, even if he has to run without a shirt on. A few days later, Pablo resumed the attack, and for this time he used explosives. One commercial airliner he managed to detonate was enough to shock the government. It turned out that not only in the city but also certain places were the target of the explosion. Actually, Pablo was nearby, but he was on the run. Still, he took time to walk the streets with his family. The constant terror of the explosion finally led the government to take the negotiation path. Pablo finally agreed to surrender and would surrender, on the condition that extradition be deactivated. And he also asked for the prison for which he should provide. This is what money can buy everything. On June 19, 1991, Pablo was officially arrested and imprisoned in a prison that he himself had made. It sure doesn't look like public prison, but more like an apartment like his house. There are also some sports fields. Can even throw a party with the prostitutes. And as agreed. Now the extradition threat is neutralized. Eventually, Pablo in prison would be free to take care of his drug dealing again. Outside says imprisoned, but inside he is in charge of his own business. Every week Pablo's family would visit him. It's kind of like family time. Sadly at the time, the very dear Pablo and his family was not allowed out of prison when all he wanted to do was buy his son's favorite ice cream. She felt so sad, and with tears in her eyes, but luckily Victoria calmed down by calling him back as he passed, and he said that he would buy the world's best ice cream for her child. Meanwhile, somewhere else. Now that Virginia was poor, she sold all her possessions, her furniture to pay for her life. And what's worse, it's been boycotted by any TV station, and shunned by people. Finally, on one occasion he came to Pablo for protection and $80,000 to move to Europe. But Pablo refused. Since Virginia was such a threat, it would expose everything she knew about him. Now that Virginia is completely hopeless, no more jobs, no more people, and all of her possessions are gone. One night, Pablo met with his friends from the cartel of Cali to discuss sales results that didn't fit the original agreement. They explained that business is not what it used to be, and that it was very difficult for the belongings to enter America. Pablo didn't want to know that he still wanted the tax payments, and the proceeds of the sale were paid as usual. And yet they refused, until they were brutally killed.
Families can put their pieces back together. Agradezcan, hijo de putas. ¿Cuál el bracito?
The killings went back to the press, and making the government the more questionable about his arrest of Pablo Escobar, the more questionable his credibility. The government would eventually transfer him to military prison. However, time will be taken. On July 20th, 92, it turned out that Pablo was a step ahead. Because it turns out he wasn't found in his prison anymore. As matters turned out, Pablo's former business partner, a murdered member of the government, was collaborating with the government in exchange for the dismissal of the charges against them. Not even that, guys. Members of a rival cartel of the militant group are collaborating with government troops, backed up with the DIA and the CIA. The government used the hands of Pablo's rival cartels to kill anyone who was dealing with him. Whether it was his lawyer, intern, accounting, all got killed everywhere. Even Virginia herself was almost killed. It's a good thing there was bulletproof glass protecting it. It's Virginia who can't stand it. Finally agreed to cooperate with a separate agency, and to expose Pablo's weakness, and he thought that the only thing that mattered most in his life was his wife and his 2 children. Meanwhile, Pablo's little hideaway seemed to be relaxing with his 2 little ones. The dear Pablo suggested that they leave Colombia immediately. But that's a shame, because the next day they were at the airport. The intelligence and the DIA
intercepted their departure
and take them straight to the airport hotel. Pablo, who was watching the news, got upset and immediately called his wife to see how he was doing. It turns out that, guys, it was a setup the government designed because it was next to Pablo's wife's room. There have been partitions, and his other members are monitoring and listening to their conversations. That's not just outside. The other agents are trying to pick up the phone signal Pablo is using. The longer Pablo waited, the more concerned he became about his family's safety. He'll know if he calls back. His side will soon know where it is. The biggest, most sadistic mobster in the world couldn't cope with his worries, especially with his 2 children. And finally, Gaze. She was no longer aware of her safety, just to talk, to listen to her child's voice, and that's when the DIA
tracked Pablo down
and start directing all his troops. She also spoke with her son, saying that she had something to tell the media. If the prosecution had actually agreed to let his family leave the country, but not keeping his promise. They had also agreed to save Escobar's family when he surrendered. But the government doesn't keep it either. Before the phone hung up, even though he gave his commission to be the head of the family, to take care of his sister and his mother, and soon after that, Pablo was shot dead. All the members of him cheered with Pablo's death, but not with his wife and children. On the other hand, Virginia also felt guilty that deep down in her heart she loved Don Pablo Escobar very much. See you in the next video. I gotta go, bye.